Hello again, Perspectives in Child Maltreatment. This is Module 5, Child Neglect. What is child neglect? It is the failure to meet the minimum requirements for care. Let's look at a specific law. Any recent act or failure to act on part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious injury, or emotional harm, sexual abuse or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. Some advocates say that this language is not precise enough, but let's think about this language for a second. Any action or failure to act which results in the death, injury, emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation. So if a parent is not actively protecting children and something terrible happens to them, they can be charged. We're going to get into this specifically throughout the course of this lecture. At the very minimum, parents should be providing food, clothing, water, shelter, and medical care. So all of this would be included in the basic maintenance care children need. For instance, children who are wandering outside in the snow with no coat, bare feet, maybe just in their diaper. Parents have been reported and charged with neglect for something like that. Much difference exists among state statutes, so let's take a look. Fetal neglect. By 2005, 5 states had neglect statutes that penalized parents for exposing their children to drug and alcohol abuse prenatally, that is, before the child is born. By 2011, 12 states had neglect statutes that included fetal neglect. Illinois defines neglect and includes a newborn whose blood or urine or meconium contains any amount of a controlled substance. Minnesota defines this: prenatal exposure to a controlled substance used by the mother for a non-medical purpose, as evidenced by withdrawal symptoms in the child at birth. A positive toxicology includes prenatal exposure to a controlled substance used by the mother for a non-medical purpose, as evidenced by withdrawal symptoms in the child at birth. So what is a positive toxicology? Prenatal abuse or prenatal neglect will be evidenced by a positive toxicology. This is basically a positive drug test from a newborn. The meconium test is the child's first bowel movement, and it is routinely tested. In some cases, children have withdrawal symptoms because they are born addicted to whatever substance their mother was addicted to. Legislators have chosen to see prenatal drug exposure as neglect. This is a failure of the parent to provide an adequate prenatal environment. Postnatal exposure to drugs is also included in the neglect statutes of 10 states. These statutes have listed exposure to drug production as a specific way in which parents may fail to provide a safe environment for their children. So, for instance, parents are cooking meth on the premises where a child lives. There are cases where children will be found when DEA agents raid a meth lab. So they raid a house and there is a camper behind the house. These are very explosive, very volatile chemicals that are used in the production of meth. Children within a close proximity to this could easily be harmed. In some cases, they can be harmed with exposure to the chemicals. We have interviewed children who are found at a meth bust. Children are oftentimes interviewed to find out their knowledge of what's going on, their exposure to harmful chemicals. And in some cases, children can actually get into drugs. Parents are making meth and children get into the chemicals, ingest the chemicals, then this is clearly a violation of the statute. So let me just read this definition. The person responsible for the care of a child. That means if this is a biological child, an adopted child, a foster child, or someone in your care. In the presence of the child, manufactured a dangerous substance. This substance possesses a product containing ephedrine, its salts, optical isomers, salts of optical isomers, and pseudoephedrine. So these substances are particularly harmful, and they're harmful to adults, they're harmful to children. So Iowa has operationalized this. If the parent has the intent to use the product as a precursor or an intermediary to a dangerous substance. The reason why we need these kind of laws is because meth production is happening, and meth production is happening around children. Now, postnatal exposure to drugs. Parents may also expose children to drug paraphernalia. I had personal experience coming into contact with a family whereby a toddler picked up a needle after the parents had been freebasing. The parents had passed out after getting high. The child then picked up the needle, put it in their arm, and became seriously ill. The child was taken into custody and eventually was reunified with parents. And this could have ended a lot worse than what it did. This is neglect in every state. Unique neglect statutes in Nebraska, leaving a child under the age of 6 in a car unsupervised. Very high profile deaths in Mississippi. Usually there are 1 or 2 every summer. Montana, failure to provide cleanliness. Connecticut and Mississippi, threats to a child's moral development. This is having pornographic material that children can access on a computer. It's not regulated or monitored, or pornographic videos or magazines that children can get into. California differentiates between neglect and serious neglect. In New Mexico, North Carolina, Idaho, North Dakota, and Ohio all specify illegal adoption as neglect. Mississippi instituted a new law, parental power of attorney, to avoid illegal adoptions. This law allows parents to designate who can keep their children without a judge's oversight. And historically, children are removed from a parent's custody by the state government if there has been neglect or there has been abuse. In some cases, guardianship must be awarded by a judge. So parents must transfer guardianship. Parental power of attorney is a unique arrangement whereby parents can get this document Both biological parents can sign this, get it notarized, and this gives parental power of attorney to whomever the parents choose. If both biological parents sign this document, their child may live with whomever they choose without a judge's approval. Those with parental power of attorney in Mississippi can consent to anything but abortion. So this would enable the parental power of attorney to put the child in school, get them insurance, and just about anything else. To find your state's law, you can go to this website, childwelfare.gov. Be an informed mandated reporter. It could be that you're taking this course, you are in Mississippi, very shortly you will be in another state because of college. After college and university, after perhaps a grad program, you become a CPS worker in another state. You will need to be very well aware of whatever state statutes are in place. Subtypes of neglect, physical neglect, not getting the child the nutrition they need. Domestic violence is a form of neglect, exposing children to a harsh environment. Emotional neglect, medical neglect, not getting children the health care that they need. Mental health neglect, not getting them the mental health support. Educational neglect, not putting them in school. And of course, abandonment, simply leaving them alone. With physical neglect, this is a failure to meet the minimum physical needs of the child, including food, shelter, clothing, protection from harm or danger. There could be some debate as to what is appropriate nourishment. 3 balanced meals a day would be ideal, but is this necessarily malnourishment? There is some gray area. What we could look at is caloric need. So there can be estimated caloric need. How many calories a day is this child getting? Based on their age, based on their height, we can clearly identify the estimated number of calories, and it could be 1 meal a day. They're eating a big dinner. This is not necessarily neglect. When we look at neglect, we're saying that there is caloric deficits. There's nutritional deficits, and also there is a chronic nature of neglect. We are not requiring perfect parenting. We are requiring basic parenting by the law. We see a wide range of children in our school systems. Some have as close to perfect as you can get. And others are really struggling just to get the basic requirements, the basic necessities of life. And that's really what we're looking at. When might the state intervene? We talked about caloric deficits. What about cases of morbid obesity? Does a child face imminent harm? Do we have a reasonable belief that intervention from the state will be helpful? Morbid obesity is a comorbid condition constituting serious imminent harm in childhood. This could be labeled as medical neglect. This is one of those topics that is oftentimes debated. It really comes to a frontline discussion here in Mississippi because we have a lot of morbid obesity among childhood populations. Many of our residents in Mississippi live in food deserts, which just means that the poorer communities live further away from fresh produce, from grocery stores where you find affordable, healthful foods. And so you find a overrepresentation of fast foods. State courts in California, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Texas, Michigan, Iowa, Indiana, and New York have supported CPS removal of children for morbid obesity. What about seatbelts and car seats? Reasonable efforts to protect children from harm should be made. We have a lot of people that will drive their children around in cars, perhaps buckling them without a car seat. And in some cases, I would say in best case scenario, there is gross ignorance here. It's possible that you are aware, hopefully you are aware, that if I'm a grown adult and I have my 5-year-old son sitting on my lap and I buckle myself and my child in, this places his life at great risk. If there is a car accident, the full weight of my force of my body is really going to press in on him. This is why a car seat is absolutely critical. What you find is you might have 5 to 8 people in a car, not enough room to get everybody a ride and have a car seat. So if you see this, I would say you see it all the time in rural areas here in Mississippi. This is highly unfortunate. I think it's important that we are educated ourselves and that we begin to be those frontline educators. If people in your family, people that you know and in your communities are not using seatbelts, are not using effective car seats and getting the information they need. Also, appropriate shelter, suitable place of abode. Is this subjective? If a family's living in a car or a tent or a teepee or a yurt, what is appropriate shelter? CPS workers will need to be familiar of what is socially acceptable and what are social norms. It may be within the bounds of social norms for a family to live in a teepee, but not in this area. What we might be faced with as frontline workers, whether it be a school counselor or a social worker, is a family living in a trailer. Perhaps the trailer is not well maintained. Perhaps there are many children, people living in this confined place. Is the residence clean? Do kids get the food they need? Are they getting bathed? Are they brushing their teeth? Are they doing their homework? Are they getting up on time for school? Do they have access to material that is not appropriate for their age? CPS workers will often judge the suitability by cleanliness or lack thereof. So when we talk about acceptable shelter, inevitably we discuss hoarding. There is a disorder in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for hoarding disorder. And when you have those adults who meet diagnostic criteria for hoarding disorder, and they have children in their home, that means the children are living in a house with the hoarder. Parents are oftentimes diagnosed and charged with neglect, because that means that this child's oftentimes having to move lots of junk out of the way so they can find their bed and place to stay. This is not an environment that is healthy and suitable for child development. This can include criminal neglect and child endangerment. And there have been cases where children are removed from their home because their parents are hoarding. So when does state intervention take place? Adequate supervision for children and protecting them from harm is an absolute mandate, and it's a necessity. Child endangerment happens when the parents place a child in a situation that is potentially harmful. If someone in the family is a registered sex offender, they are not allowed to be in contact with children. If a parent knowingly allows their child to be within close proximity of someone who is on the sexual offenders registry list, if the child is harmed or in danger, then CPS intervention, CPS investigation will be a possibility. CPS intervention occurs when there's a failure to provide a safe environment. Domestic violence. This is a risk factor for maltreatment. Physical harm versus psychological harm can sometimes be a false dichotomy. Just because we have one doesn't mean we don't have them both. So when kids see their parents involved in domestic violence, this can cause intense post-traumatic stress and psychological harm. There are 10 million children every year who are exposed to viewing domestic violence. Physical neglect includes inadequate medical or dental care, chronic sleepiness, and poor personal hygiene. Other physical neglect indicators: poor supervision, kids playing around possibly all day without adult supervision, kids putting themselves to bed, kids responsible for bathing themselves without any kind of guidance or direction. That would likely include them not bathing. Health and safety hazards. The home lacks heating or plumbing. There's other unsafe conditions, inadequate sleeping arrangements, poor nutritional content, and spoiled food in the cupboards. Emotional neglect. This includes a failure to meet a child's emotional needs. Medical neglect. Failure to seek medical treatment, a failure to provide prescribed treatment, and a delay in seeking treatment. State intervention may also take place when there is a mental health neglect. So this would include a failure to seek help for a child's severe psychological problems or to comply with recommended therapeutic procedures. Educational neglect is the easiest to document. It's not subjective. It's simply a failure to enroll children in school or a lack of attention to their educational needs. Abandonment would include desertion, severing ties with the child, and failing to support one's own child. Thanks for viewing this. I look forward to hearing your comments, reactions about neglect as a form of child maltreatment. See you for Module 6.